Hey, so I'm in Bellevue, Washington, and Washington State. Bellevue is essentially a suburb of Seattle, and I have to say that it's kind of soulless, which is odd because it's done everything right on paper. Of course, Seattle is one of the headquarters of Amazon. Of course, you've got nearby, you've got Microsoft, and so on. So you have a lot of smart people here, you have a lot of diverse people here, but it's a bit odd because, I just walked through a park in the middle of essentially a suburb. And, that's a great idea. And in fact, I'm walking now to another park, which is probably connected to another park. And it's just sort of a reminder that you can do everything right as a politician. And yet, if you're missing the key ingredient, which is people, you're still not going to succeed on a long-term basis. And I should know this better than anybody else, right? Is that the places are really attractive based on the people within them, as opposed to the city planning, despite how perfect the city planning might be. One of the reasons for that is because it's expensive here. So, you've got to try to figure out a couple of things. If you're a politician, you can't just focus on superb city planning. You've got to also focus on something like, housing inflation. If you're in a position where you have not segregation, this place is too affluent. It's got too much money. And, you've got, apparently Bill Gates might have a home here nearby somewhere. And, again, it just seems like there's something missing despite the fact that it looks perfect. And of course, you go back to the whole Pleasantville situation. But overall, part of the reason is because a city can't be separated from its demographics and from inflation, especially housing inflation. So you get a sense that a lot of the American society is moving towards it was layaway, rent to own. Now we're moving into a leasing situation, whether it's an Uber situation, no hard assets. We're moving over to a leasing situation, a temporary leasing situation, where the ownership becomes more and more concentrated. And the reason that's happening isn't necessarily because it's what everybody wants. It's happening because when you don't control inflation, especially when you have low interest rates for a long time, you end up with a lot of winners and a lot of losers. And what's odd about the situation, of course, is that, it's not that people that have lost have done anything wrong. They've simply been on the wrong side of the banking structure. So if let's say you just had cash, let's say you just don't want debt, well, you've lost out over the last 10, 15 years. And you probably haven't been able to create a situation where you're able to compete with the gains of people who bought, say, 2 homes using the bank's money. And you get a sense this is a little bit unsustainable, despite how many financial loopholes or innovations might result. So as I'm here in a beautiful place, it's a little bit terrifying to me, just because you can have, everything is perfect here. You've even got Japanese cherry blossoms right here. Boeing, of course, was founded in Seattle. You've got the University of Washington. So you've literally got a perfect setup. And for this city, I'm being unfair. It's not really a city, right? It's a suburb. So all suburbs feel kind of soulless. But that's not really it. I've been to Seattle, and again, there's a limit to the sustainability, just being a sustainable city environmentally. But what people don't realize is there's also an issue with being sustainable on a demographic basis, which Japan obviously knows about. And so, something to think about. And let's just jump into 2 other issues. So one of the reasons that politics has become so extreme in America, part of these things are just human nature. They happen everywhere. And, one of the reasons is that when you speak, you tend to be less measured than when you write. And when I write, I try to be measured. I have more time. I can always go back and fix something and improve upon it. And I often find that it takes 6 months after I write something, I can almost always find a mistake, which is odd, assuming that I'm a halfway decent writer. For me to go back 6 months later and then not realize I'd missed, in some cases, a fairly obvious grammatical mistake. That's just the way it is. So there's always room for improvement, even though I've got an English degree from a good public university. Again, it's just this idea that there's always room for improvement. And the question is, especially, I say that here, right, because I've just called this suburb essentially a perfect Pleasantville. And yet, I really don't know what to say in terms of improvements. So, there's also a sense that a lot of life is the intangibles, the things you can't control, which runs counter to a society that is now dependent on data, technology, Amazon and Microsoft. What are they? They're technology companies. Amazon started out as I'm going uphill. I'm not this out of shape. Hope not. So Amazon started out as a book company, selling books online, eventually moving into AWS, cloud computing, and became a technology company. That's been sort of the progress that's been made. And so when we talk about a Pleasantville, a lot of it is this idea that all the data in the world can't help you understand intangibles. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we have such a difficult time reforming education, which is by nature subjective and long-term and uneven. But getting back to my point is that politics everywhere is probably a bit extreme in the absence of censorship. Because if I'm speaking, a very active speaking, I'm trying to get your attention. And I'm also competing with other forms of media. And I've been at weddings where I've actually bought a newspaper, and if somebody, at one of the weddings I went to, somebody started talking about building a deck in his house, after 15 minutes, I just took out my newspaper and started reading. So you're always competing, right? No matter how interesting you think what you're saying is. And that causes people within a political spectrum to create a society where extremists oftentimes have an advantage in the absence of censorship. All of this is counterintuitive to the American mind, which has been taught that democracy is the highest form of politics ever invented. And we're finding out that that's just not the case. A bit too late, perhaps, but better late than never. So that's one of the things you want to understand, that human nature has made a lot of the democracies in the 21st century and the 20th century has tilted it towards extremism, simply because when you have a television and when you have a segregated society that is also segregated economically, public versus private, in order to give you more options, if you take that kind of a society and then within it you have a government that's lost control of the technological standard, has essentially outsourced it to technology companies, including right here or nearby, you start to create a society that's based on signaling values. And, that's where you have these accusations of a nanny state and so on and so forth. What is the nice? I hope this is not private property. It is. I'm not going to go there. So, this is an easement. So I'm okay here, but only up to that point. So that's something to think about when you study the United States. Ultimately we have democracy, but democracy within that kind of an environment almost prefers or favors the person making more extreme statements. And it's not until the person actually goes into office that they have to compromise, and suddenly you see that you've got a problem, right? You've got the gap between expectations and promises and so on, which then typically causes more extremism, right? As more and more people realize that if they've been lied to, even if it's in good faith, they start to say, well, why don't we just keep going, ratchet up the rhetoric, and maybe something will get done. But of course, especially in a society that's as fragmented as the United States, oftentimes you'll see the rhetoric simply moving away from actions. Especially in a country where the federal government has a $1 trillion deficit. And then within the budget itself, about 2/3 of the budget is already allocated on the federal side, whether it's to entitlement spending, essentially, Social Security, Medicare, what I call old people spending, and to, say, military contracts and so on, and then, of course, debt payments, interest payments, and so on. So you've got that issue you want to consider when considering the United States on a historical basis. The other thing I wanted to talk about is this idea that, let me try to think about this, because I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain it. So we talked about Bellevue, Washington. We talked about politics and extremism. And let me show you this house over here, which is beautiful. And then I'll catch my breath. This is the kind of house that I would want if I wanted to live here. I don't know what you call it, but it's sleek. Simple, effective, and so on. And I'm now at a dead end. Okay. Well, time to go back down and try to think about what my third topic was. Obviously, people are doing well here. There's construction behind me. That house looks brand new. So we have these different topics we wanted to discuss: with extremism, with Seattle, and of course, overall, this idea that of entropy within an age where you have to really compete for people's eyeballs. And what would be the solution? Oh, I think I'm supposed to make a right at this street over here to get to the beach. Well, it's not really a beach, it's just a park. It's called Chisholm Beach, I think, Beach Park. There are a lot of lakes out here. And so again, that gives you a very sort of calming environment. And, that of course is very appealing to have this idea of essentially a second city right outside of Seattle, the hustle and bustle of Seattle, where, you can create not just a suburb, but, almost a competitor to Seattle, but in a more quiet way. I'm going to step over here. And much apologies for the post office van coming by. So we have human nature and everything else. I think, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to stop here. I can't actually remember what my third topic was going to be, and so that'll do it for now.